I've always heard people say that art is subjective, but I think those people never played Fire Emblem. There is no person out there who considers Alm's Gaiden look better than his Echo's look. I don't believe that for a second. But no other transformation shows so clearly how much Fire Emblem's art style has changed over the years. When we look at how many artists have been in charge of character designs, it's no surprise either. I mean, the highest number of games that share their artist is 2. That's how often Fire Emblem changes designers. Currently, it's even normal for the series to bring in artists from outside Intelligent Systems to take charge, but that definitely wasn't the case at first. In fact, we have no clue who designed the characters for Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, the one that started it all. The credits do have 4 graphic designers listed, but it has never been confirmed who actually drew the artwork for the game's cover, for example. Similarly, we also don't know whether the in-game sprites came first or the artwork did. Nowadays, the art is always first and the game assets are modeled after those. But back in those days, starting with sprites was actually the norm, so it is quite likely that the in-game portraits were made first and then the drawn artwork was based on that. Either way, when looking at the general art style of this game, I think for most of us it will look a tad goofy and reminiscent of a Sunday morning cartoon you might see in the 90s. All characters feel a little chibi-esque and unserious. It's a style you can't really imagine Fire Emblem using today. But all the way back in 1990, when this game was released, this was actually a pretty decent attempt at what at the time was the leading anime style. It wasn't a one-to-one recreation, possibly due to the people drawing it not being actual professional artists themselves. But the general anime look of the 80s was very much the inspiration for both the official artwork for the game as well as the portraits in-game, especially in regards to hairstyle, which is really the only defining feature in some of them. Another important thing to consider is the standard of box art on the NES or Famicom. Nowadays, it is absolutely a must for your box art to, resemble your game, but back then this really wasn't that normal. Mega Man is a famous example where the box art just looks nothing like the actual game, but this happened a lot more too, especially with games that had hand-drawn box arts. And that is something that you have to give Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light a huge amount of credit for. This art very accurately portrays the portraits as seen in-game, which again sounds like the bare minimum today, but really wasn't back in those days. When Gaiden released 2 years later, we would immediately see a change in art style, and if you ask me, it was for the worse. Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light may have been a little goofy, but at least it looked nice. Gaiden's is just crudely drawn is the phrase I want to use. Maybe out of shame, the designer of these has also never been made public, but it has been rumored it could be Toru Osawa, who is not credited in-game, but has done work on previous Fire Emblem games, as stated by the development team of the Valentia remake, and has an art style that somewhat bears a resemblance to the art of Gaiden. Stylistically, I want to say the intent behind it was still that it resembled the same anime tropes that Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light went for, with young-looking characters that have large eyes and odd proportions. But not only was, in my opinion at least, that execution not as well done as in the prior game, this artwork also does not resemble the characters as much as you would like. Celica is depicted with pink or red armor in-game, but yellow in artwork. Alm has blue hair in-game rather than the green of the artwork, and the list goes on and on. So while Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light managed to impressively avoid falling into that Famicom trap, Gaiden could not. But maybe it were exactly those mistakes that helped Intelligent Systems realize something had to change. For the next title, Mystery of the Emblem, an actual professional artist was brought in, known as Katsuyoshi Koya. He had previously worked for the Fire Emblem trading card game, and to put it simply, he could actually draw what anime looked like in the 90s, instead of only trying and kinda getting there. Which is also why the art for Mystery of the Emblem looks a lot better than the previous 2 titles, even if by today's standards it's a little rough and feels outdated. At the time though, this was a fairly accurate recreation of the style of plenty of popular animes. The in-game portraits now followed suit, with the increased power of the Super Famicom allowing the devs to make the characters look less unserious, and make them more closely resemble the anime tropes of the time. That meant wavy, lush and long hair for the men, but more straight hair for the women, and very little shading. Compared to the two prior games, I would say this has aged a lot better, even if especially the character designs make some odd choices they probably wouldn't make today. But the progress was evident, and so, when the next game was in development, Genealogy of the Holy War, Kazuyoshi Koya was given the honorable task of not just drawing art for the characters, but also designing them, becoming the first known person to take on this job. If I had to summarize the general character design in this game in 2 words, I would say aggressively 90s. Whereas Mystery of the Emblem was still dipping its toes into contemporary tropes, Genealogy of the Holy War cannonballed right into the deep end. This game is basically just as true to its contemporary anime conventions as today's games are. The only difference is that the conventions FE4 goes for have now long passed. But you don't have to be an art critic to notice that Koya simply was a better artist than those in charge of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light and Gaiden. The proportions are much better, the characters actually look like humans now, and while we currently never see animes that use this watercolored paint style, there is nothing inherently wrong with it. In the character design department, I'd say it even goes a step further than Mystery of the Emblem did, with the amount of mullets nearly as high as the number of playable characters. Again, this is something that looks quite odd now, but at the time this was completely normal for anime men to have. Nowadays, we occasionally still see this in the newer games, but in Genealogy of the Holy War, nearly every male character has long hair. That really isn't common anymore. Despite Genealogy of the Holy War being a massive success for the series, Kazuyoshi Koya was not asked to return for the next game, despite it being set in the same world. For Thracia 776, Mayumi Hirota was brought in on recommendation of series creator Sho Zukaga himself, who considered her art for the Fire Emblem Treasure Book to be a perfect representation of his vision for Jugdrawl. Harsh on Koya if you ask me, but what Kaga says happens for at least one more game, so Hirota was brought on board. Compared to Koya, her style was more subdued, more gritty and less bright, which is clearly reflected in the art for Thracia. All colors are a lot lighter and look a lot more realistic, down to extra details of the surroundings being included in the character art. The characters themselves do still feel quite similar to Genealogy of the Holy War, which further shows how this was merely a reflection of anime tropes at the time. Personally, I think this style has definitely aged a whole lot better than Genealogy of the Holy Wars, exactly because it goes for a tad more realism, which will become a new focus for anime going forward. Hirota wouldn't work on Fire Emblem again, however. When Sho Zukaga left Intelligent Systems, she went with him and continued to work on the Tearing Saga series he created. But it did mean another vacancy had opened up at Intelligent Systems, one that would be filled up by Eiji Kaneda. He had never worked on Fire Emblem before being brought in as character designer for The Binding Blade, but had instead earned his stripes in the manga industry, providing the art for a series known as AB Extreme. And what he did there, he basically did again for Binding Blade. His cover art for the second AB Extreme novel especially has a very similar art style to the Binding Blade, right down to the odd faces, I want to call it. Most elements of the Binding Blade's art begin to slowly turn into the more modern style we have now, but things like the coloring and the faces feel a bit too limited and simplistic to really hit a home run. The quality is a little all over the place as such, with some characters looking really great like Zephiel, while others like Juno feel a bit undercooked. But at least the sprite work is phenomenal across the board, courtesy of Sachiko Wada, who actually did the sprite work for Thracia 776 as well, but really stepped up her game for this entry, I would say. The duo of Kaneda and Wada would remain intact for the revisit to a leap with the Blazing Blade, and I want to compliment Kaneda here, because he showed a lot of progress in the year between the two games, only to go uncredited for his efforts in the Blazing Blade. But hey, at least we know he deserves the plaudits for the great improvements made here. Just compare Roy to Eliwood. The coloring, the shading, the details all have much improved in the jump from Binding to Blazing. Personally, I have always felt this is where Fire Emblem's character design truly entered a modern era, where characters wouldn't need a significant redesign in order to look more modern and fit in with the current crop. That hasn't stopped them from giving Lyn massive eyes, mind you, but I digress. Art style wise, we weren't there yet in 2003. Even if the art of say Hector looks great, you can tell it wasn't drawn yesterday. But character design wise, I don't think we've seen massive philosophy changes since the Blazing Blade. which is made even more impressive when you know that the person that made this art, Eiji Kaneda, would not return for the final Fire Emblem game for GBA, the Sacred Stones. Instead, sprite master Sachiko Wada was now promoted, I guess you could say, and would not just handle the sprites for Sacred Stones, but also the art style and character design. In a way, I think she kinda did with the Blazing Blade style what Miyumi Hirota did for the Genealogy of the Holy War style. The art style for Sacred Stones is not a radical difference, but it adds more realistic, gritty tones and muted colors after Kaneda, who was definitely more on the vibrant end of the color spectrum. And that's not to say Evrim and Erika are grey and boring, they're definitely not. But even if, say, Erika's design has a lot of bright colors in its Sacred Stones depiction it really isn't as vibrant as you would expect. Make no mistake though, Sacred Stones has phenomenal art pieces associated with it, with this incredible painting as the prime example. Despite her phenomenal work, Sachiko Wada would not continue in her role as art designer going forward, but she would remain on the team for the Tellius games before leaving Intelligent Systems. But don't worry, she has remained close to the series and to this day designs the art for one of the Choose Your Legends winners in Fire Emblem Heroes. The new person in charge of character designs was Senri Kita, another new hire who had never worked on Fire Emblem prior to Path of Radiance. She had however worked in the video game industry before, particularly doing designs for SNK's Samurai Showdown series. Especially the art for Samurai Showdown Warrior's Rage really shows what Kita's style is, and she brought it in full force for the two Tellius games. In comparison to especially Sacred Stones, I would say this style feels a lot more colorful, vibrant and even cartoony in a way, which is a bit of an interesting departure because it's really the first and arguably only time Fire Emblem has ever gone against the grain of the popular anime tropes at the time. During the early 2000s, anime was definitely shifting more towards realism, so as was Fire Emblem, with the titles the Tellius games are sandwiched in between, and yet they themselves don't appear to follow it too closely. In Path of Radiance there are still some art pieces that feel like they belong more in the Blazing Blade though, with Mia being a good example. But by the time Radiant Dawn rolls around, Kita has found her groove and almost all art looks uniform, colorful and just really good if you ask me. That's probably also why in Path of Radiance, Sachiko Wada still drew the portraits based on Kita's art, while on Radiant Dawn, Kita also did the portraits herself. From a character design perspective, I think the key word for these two games is outfits. Previously, probably because in-game there were only portraits, the lower down someone's body you looked, the less detail you saw. Many characters wore baggy pants and barely had leg armor, but this has completely changed for the Tellius titles, probably partially due to the new portraits that extended far below the shoulders. It led to a lot more intricate designs, a prime example of which is Titania. Just compare the level of detail in her armor to someone like Gwendolyn, the difference is night and day. Despite her phenomenal work on the Tellius titles, Senri Kita would not return for the Fire Emblem remakes released for DS, as was becoming a bit of a custom right around this time. The remake of Shadow Dragon has become a bit infamous among fans for its art style, especially in-game, going for a look that is honestly kind of hard to describe. It always reminded me a little of something like Donkey Kong Country, which uses sprites made out of 3D models. Not sure if that's actually how it was done, but if it was definitely a mistake. The Fire Emblem games on GBA looked 10 times better, and that's not what you want on a new console. As for the art style of the game itself, things have clearly been returned to a bit more of a realistic look for this entry. You could even argue it goes a bit too far. Around this time, the general anime look had kinda settled on what it largely still is today, but I suspect that wasn't what Intelligent Systems was aiming for. Instead, they appear to have been trying to go for a more modernized version of the art style that was prevalent when the original Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light released, which would explain why they brought in Masamune Shiro. He is an absolute legend in the manga world, and is the creator of the well-known Ghost in the Shell manga, so he definitely earned his stripes. And, uncoincidentally, Ghost in the Shell hails from around the same time as Shadow Dragon. So the idea that Shiro will be able to bring Marv and his crew into a modern age without losing their original appearance was a fair thought, but I have to say, it didn't pan out. The few pieces Shiro designed for Shadow Dragon really don't look too good in my opinion, with designs that use a lot of straight lines and are very harsh as a result. I do like the coloring though, they're very nice and vibrant without becoming unrealistic, so props for that, but in general I wouldn't say Shiro and Fire Emblem were a great fit. And so he wasn't brought back for new Mystery of the Emblem, with the role instead staying in-house for the first time in a while. Daisuke Iizuka had already done some art for Shadow Dragon's new characters like Athena, and was now in charge of all of them for the Japanese exclusive sequel. And while he was unable to bring Fire Emblem's art style into the modern era for 100%, I do think he gave a very valiant effort. The art for New Mystery is in my opinion leagues better than Shadow Dragon, something that is especially prevalent with Marvin Shida, who received artwork for both titles. New Mystery of the Emblem has a softer style that suits Fire Emblem better and aligns more with the contemporary look of popular anime, up until this day really. Again, it's still not quite at that level, it still has a certain cartoon look to it rather than an anime one, but you can definitely see their mind is in the right place. And that sentiment would be confirmed going into the 3DS. A lot has been said about what Awakening did right to save the series, from going all in on supports to its grounded story. But I think a massively overlooked element is its art style. Both Awakening and Fates were designed by Yusuke Kosaki, who had previously done some work for the Fire Emblem TCG, but that wasn't anything massive. According to the man himself, he received an email from Intelligent Systems telling him to design 60 characters for a new game, at which point Kosaki realized what he'd be working on. If you ask me, it was a match made in heaven, and exactly what Fire Emblem needed at a time where it was close to going under. Kosaki had a truly modern style that resonated very well with new audiences Fire Emblem had never been able to tap into before. This and the expanded supports worked hand in hand to create a game where players would truly find themselves connected and invested in the characters in a way that had never happened before. Character designs had never been this varied before, with all kinds of intricate designs that resulted in a bit of a Pokemon philosophy. There was one for everyone. Everyone was likely to find a character design they really liked. After the massive success that Awakening was, it was only sensible for Kosaki to remain for Fates as well, but personally, I am of the opinion he was unable to capture lightning in a bottle twice. The art direction is the same, so no comments there, but across the board, I am not as big a fan of Fates' character design compared to Awakening's. Many characters feel too similar, too many follow the path of Farja, if you get what I mean, and don't stand out enough. Part of that is because the generic enemies and bosses actually look really great in this game, which is definitely worthy of praise, but in a way also kind of amplifies my problems with Fate's character designs. That's not to say there aren't any phenomenal designs here, by the way, there definitely are, I'm speaking more in general terms. After also setting IS up with the start of Fire Emblem Heroes, Kosaki would not return for the next remake, Shadows of Valentia. The honor this time went to Hidari, which is an artist name meaning left side, referencing the fact he's left-handed. Hidari worked on several games before joining the Fire Emblem legacy, most prominently the Atelier series, as well as a bunch of animes. There were actually already plans to hire Hidari for the Awakening DLC, but he was busy at the time, so for Shadows of Valentia they made sure to book him early and in advance, and man, did that pay off. Echoes' art style is widely considered to be the best among the fanbase, I feel like, and I can absolutely see why. Hidari arguably was dealt the most difficult hand of this era, having to redesign characters from Gaiden rather than create his own, and if you remember how Gaiden looked, that couldn't be easy. But somehow, Hidari managed to give every single character in this game a 10 out of 10 makeover. I genuinely can't mention one character whose design here I'm not a fan of. All of them are amazing. The style combines realism and grounded looks with that anime style that worked really well before, and then adds another layer of artistic personality that you could argue Awakening and Fates maybe missed a little. The soft textures and colors make everything look so rich, detailed and classy, and especially that last one was quite needed after Fates, I think. Combine this all with the additional full voice acting, and it leads to a game where the presentation factor really is leagues beyond even its fellow 3DS games. And that is honestly a miracle, cause the presentation there is nothing to scoff at either. But as has become tradition at this point, even Hidari would not return. For Three Houses, the job would be handed to Chinatsu Kurahana. Unlike her two predecessors, she hadn't worked with games much before, and was best known for her work on visual novels and animes. She was allegedly brought in because the team believed she would best be able to create a style that suited the more upper echelon themes of Three Houses, where most characters were offstanding. Personally, I don't believe Kurahana is the best artist to ever work on Fire Emblem or anything, but I do think she was essentially perfect for the task at hand. What she's really good at is characteristic and unique faces, and that is exactly what Three Houses needed, seeing as half of this game puts like 90% of its characters in the same outfit. All to differentiate them are their faces, and that's what Kurahana absolutely nailed. There are so many varied and interesting hairstyles and face details that have made these characters so beloved. That outfits aren't necessarily her specialty is also something I think Three Houses shows. Especially the post-time skip outfits are quite hit and miss in my opinion. Some are fantastic, like Dimitri, Edelgard, Marianne, Felix and Petra, but others I'm not a huge fan of, like Ingrid, Bernadetta, Mercedes and even Claude if I'm being honest. But probably the biggest example is Byleth. I think male Byleth has a really great fit, but female Byleth, I mean, a lot has been said about this already, no joke I make here would ever be original, but man, it's not ideal. The leggings don't work, they look more torn up than styled, and I don't know why her navel needs a breathing hole, but it looks really weird. So yeah, I wouldn't say Three Houses is the perfect Fire Emblem art style in general, but I do think Kurahana was a fantastic fit for the themes and style of the game, even if some of her weaknesses still showed. And then finally we have Engage. Talk about a style shift. This time around, the art and characters are the brainchildren of Mika Picasso, another freelance artist who is very tapped into the contemporary trends in anime, meaning very bright colors, less realistic and younger looking characters. It's no surprise looking at the art for Engage that she has a history creating colorful avatars for VTubers and the like, because that is kind of the vibe that radiates from certain characters like Alir, Vale, Hortensia and Tamara. Personally, I once again think this was a good fit for the in-game look of Engage, which really made the colors pop and stand out. But from an artistic perspective, this is definitely not my favorite crop. It is arguably the least serious Fire Emblem has ever looked, with some designs definitely going a tad overboard in my opinion. But my biggest problem actually isn't Alir's hair color or clownesque fit, it's actually the eyes and hair of most female characters. The eyes are so large, I really dislike that. It looks especially jarring on the female emblems that have never really had this look before. I already mentioned Lyn, but Micaiah, Celica and Edelgard are no exceptions. While in general the models in Engage actually look really nice and detailed, a lot of female characters have hair that just moves and sits on top of their head like a carpet. And that is another thing I really don't like. Take Celine, female Alir or Vale as examples. Their hair doesn't look like it naturally flows, it looks like it's made of plastic, only made worse by just the sheer amount of hair they have. It's why I prefer the character designs with more modest hair in this game, like the men, or Citrine, Jade or Chimera. Hell, even Ivy and Yanaka's hair I enjoy just fine, and theirs is still far from short. All in all, I wouldn't say Engage's art is bad or ugly, I think it just does what every Fire Emblem game prior to it has done. Follow larger contemporary anime conventions and trends. And as always, that has resulted in some designs I really like and some I think are not as good. I do agree with the more popular sentiment though that in general Engage's look is not as good as what we've seen in the last decade, but it also doesn't hurt my enjoyment of the game or its characters necessarily. And to those of you who do dislike Engage's look to that extent, I just want to say, have patience my friend. If anything should be the lesson to take from this video, it's that Fire Emblem doesn't have an art style. Again, the highest number of games with the same look and designer is 2, that's absolutely nothing. So worry not, because next time we'll see the series again, it will probably look completely different. What do you consider the best Fire Emblem art styles? And what are your least favorites? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.